Hello everyone, and on behalf of WorkUP, I would like to welcome you to Working with Men and Boys Innovations from the Indo-Pacific. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging that this forum is being broadcast from unceded Yagara and Turrbal lands, and I want to pay my respects to elders past and present. Wherever you're joining from today, we are on unceded Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. And I also acknowledge and pay respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this session. It's a pleasure to have you all join us. Spark webinars are an opportunity to connect practitioners with current research, promoting knowledge sharing across the sector and creating a space for reflection, thinking and talking about practice. To begin today, I'm joined here in the room by Professor Patrick O'Leary and Dr. Freya McLachlan for the excellence in the elimination of violence against women at Griffith University. Patrick and Freya have been leading work on how we engage men and boys in the prevention of domestic and family violence across the Indo-Pacific. This work began with a roundtable. It brought together practitioners, researchers, and policy thinkers from across the region. People working in very different cultural and social settings, but often facing similar challenges. What came out of that roundtable was a strong sense of diversity in practice. Different ways of working, different starting points, but also some shared ideas. Many of those ideas relate to community, culture, and lived experience. They raise important questions about whose voices are centred, how success is defined, and what innovation really means in different contexts. In the next part of today's sessions, we'll draw on that work in two ways. First, Patrick will help set the scene. He'll reflect on the roundtable, the thinking it generated, and how we'll hear from people who are doing this work in practice across the region. We'll then turn to Freya. Freya led a scoping review that looks at interventions for men who use domestic and family violence across the Indo-Pacific. That review gives us a clear picture of what's out there, the range of approaches being used, the models that appear most often, and just as importantly, the gaps that remain. Together, Patrick and Freya will help us move from big picture context to evidence and then to practice. Patrick, I'd love to begin by setting the scene for today's conversation. Your work has consistently shown that preventing gender-based violence requires engaging men and boys, not only as potential perpetrators, but as active agents of change, capable of shifting norms and contributing to safer communities. You also highlight the unique values of learning from diverse cultural contexts across the Indo-Pacific, where community-driven and culturally grounded approaches offer important lessons for our practice here in Australia. With this in mind, I'd like to invite you to help set the scene for today's discussion.
Thanks very much, Teresa. And I also want to pay my respects to Indigenous people right through the Indo-Pacific and particularly on the lands that you're all coming to us from today. I'd also like to acknowledge people with lived experience who have experienced violence and the trauma that can result from those experiences before beginning. And that's a really good place to begin because that's, we really want to centre this on people's experience and different community experiences. And across that diversity is thinking about how we bring men and boys to the table as part of the solution. Often the approach probably from a very Western colonial is about identifying the problem, and men and boys often are positioned as the problem and not part of the solution. The problem is male violence, but men and boys in of themselves are not the problem. It's incredibly important that we think about men and boys in different ways, both that boys are not men, they're not adults, they're children, and we have to think about that in a really responsible way and accountable way. And that's something that was really clear in the roundtable, that we need to be responding to male violence in a way that differentiates adults. We also need to be really focused on also pathways for men and boys that focus on non-violence and well-being rather than the problem are focused on a pathway towards violence. We need both. We also need to think about how we how we bring together what we can learn through social service responses in Australia that we can learn from the Indo-Pacific. And that was one of the key issues that we wanted to bring together in the roundtable, and also reviewing what's happening in innovative practice across our region. And often in Australia, we've relied on a very corrective pathway through men's behavioural change programs and some carceral criminal justice responses that are important one piece, but they don't respond to all men and boys across the population. And so we're often seeing things in binary ways. So it's skewed in this way, such as violent, non-violent, perpetrator, victim, good, bad. And at CEVAW, we very much want to be influenced by some of the 3 I's that you mentioned about wanting Indigenous perspective, Indo-Pacific perspective across our diverse region, and also interdisciplinary. And with this approach, we can learn a greater amount of information about not only the challenges, but what innovation might be, how we actually define innovation, how we actually support innovation. And the state of knowledge in Australia is not so much about what we can contribute to the region, but what we can learn from the region and engage with the region in the solution of eliminating violence against women. And benefiting from this learning is really inclusive. And it was one of the key things that we wanted to do when Freya and I were working out how we approach the roundtable and this research, was bringing these experts together who come from both practice, policy, and also come from a perspective of what it is like to have lived experience. So that accountability to women's and girls' organisations and advocates in that space. So we can have some of those conversations that can be really challenging about how do we balance all these needs and priorities. And also thinking about the cultural and location-based applications for the community.
Thank you. So given the very different culture and context in the Indo-Pacific, do you anticipate Queensland practitioners might meaningfully apply the insights from yours and Freya's work? Do you think there is application in our local context?
Absolutely, is the short answer. But I think it's also about how we bring together an understanding that we live in a very diverse community in Australia and Queensland. We have different location needs, but also we need to be thinking outside of particularly what we learnt from the round table. How do we reach a wider population? How do we actually engage community to be taking responsibility rather than it to be on social service or community-based organisation? How do we bring people together on this journey?
So Patrick, the roundtable sounded really interesting. Who was there?
We held the roundtable in partnership with UNFPA, which is a key UN organisation that has a real priority of addressing gender-based violence. And so we invited people who had expertise. It was held in Bangkok in late August, and all the people that came together had expertise in gender-based violence, and this included people from civil society organisations that work directly with men and boys, as well as policymakers and a few researchers and people who work in developing programs. And one of the most important things about this in inviting is we wanted a representation across the Indo-Pacific of different experiences that contrast. We weren't able to represent all the countries and cultures, which would fill many rooms, but it did give a good overview. And Rimjim was one of those key participants and made a real contribution about how we understand the experience of people who have experienced violence and abuse, but also about the accountability and expectations in that context. So that just gives you a very brief overview of the people who took part.
Fantastic. And Rimjim, of course, is one of the people we'll be hearing from later in today's discussion. Freya, turning to you now and the scoping review that you and your colleagues led. This work gives us a valuable insight into what interventions exist for men who use domestic and family violence across the Pacific. I'd like to explore some of the key findings from that work with you, and especially what they mean for practitioners who might be joining us today. So could you start by giving us a brief overview of the scope and the purpose of your review?
Of course, and thank you so much, Teresa. I want to first start by acknowledging that this research was conducted on the lands of the unceded lands of the Turrbal and Yagara peoples in the Engine. The lands where this research were conducted have never been ceded and always will be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lands. And I also want to shout out to my co-authors on this paper, which is Talia Swart, Katie Desmond, and of course, Patrick. So, as Patrick's already mentioned, the aims of our work stream is really this idea around building men and boys into the narrative of change to bring about the end of violence against women and girls. And one of the key ways we've begun to do this is through examining how men are being engaged as both perpetrators and bystanders of violence, and also where that line between perpetrators and bystanders is, or if it even exists. Because our focus spans across the Indo-Pacific region, another key consideration for our research is how diverse cultures, contexts, and backgrounds impact the ways we engage men and boys in interventions and what is most appropriate for them. And so that's really what led us to our research questions. The first question, what intervention programs have been developed for male perpetrators of domestic and family violence in Australia and the Indo-Pacific, was really to first establish what interventions were out there and how they differed. The next one, what is the prevalence of diverse approaches in interventions for men who perpetrate domestic and family violence? This was to start to understand how practice outside the mainstream presented across the region and how common it actually was to use diverse approaches. And then our final research question, what are the features of diverse practice in interventions for men who perpetrate domestic and family violence? This was really to get a sense of the elements that make up non-traditional interventions and how this differed across the region. So we decided a scoping review was best to answer our research questions and gain a good understanding of what had already been done in this space. And for those who are unfamiliar, a scoping review is just a way to conduct a review of all the literature on a particular topic or scope. And we used a systematic method to map interventions across the region that have been written about in an academic journal. And we decided to focus on academic literature only because of the volume of work on interventions. We would have loved to include grey literature, like papers from peak bodies, NGOs and practitioners, and we hope to do that in the future. This scoping review was quite broad, and we looked at any interventions for adult male perpetrators using domestic and family violence within the Indo-Pacific region. And so this meant on our first search of 9 databases, we came back with over 20,000 articles. This led to us screening out any irrelevant articles, leaving us with 50 in total that fit our scope. And many of the articles we screened out were outside of the Indo-Pacific or didn't focus on a specific intervention. And we focused on domestic and family violence really to highlight the distinction in this type of violence when we compare it to gender-based violence more broadly.
Thanks, Freya. So your review identified 42 unique interventions across 50 papers. What stood out to you about the diversity of approaches that you saw?
Yeah, so 42 unique interventions across 50 papers. This was because some of the interventions were discussed in multiple articles, especially those that formed part of a suite of programs for both the perpetrator and impacted family members. And just to give you a little bit of context to those findings, the 42 interventions were found across 14 countries in the Indo-Pacific, including Australia, New Zealand, India, Korea, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Nepal, Japan, Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan, Taiwan, and Timor-Leste.
Mm-hmm.
It was really interesting to see that almost half of the included interventions were based in Australia, which likely represents the high level of resourcing towards gender-based violence in research and practice when compared with some of the other countries in the region. Almost 3/4 of the interventions met our criteria for novel practice. However, they weren't often identified in the paper as being innovative or unique by the facilitators of the program or the authors of the article. And this diversity in practice came through in a number of ways, including the programs being targeted for specific populations or contexts, through the use of technology or social media, through entertainment formats, or through engaging bystanders in a whole of community approach.
Almost half the interventions that you saw used a whole of community or bystander focused models. So why do you think those approaches are emerging so strongly?
And I think it's important to note that very few of these whole of community interventions were based in Australia, which I think highlights this broader finding around the reliance on a specific way to engage men in violence intervention in Australia, regardless of our really diverse population that we have living in Australia. I think whole of community approaches are so strongly represented in our review because the Indo-Pacific lens that we took in our scope. Interventions in countries throughout the region were much more likely to think about the context in which the intervention would be delivered. And in many of the included countries in the region, there's a much heavier reliance and engagement with community. So in these contexts, it would actually be ineffective to run interventions without including that broader community scope. It's also key when we think about how many men are not captured by perpetrator-specific programs. Many men perpetrate violence without ever being identified by the systems that go on to intervene in this violence. So by taking a whole of community approach, there are men who can start to engage in anti-violence work who would have otherwise gone undetected and in turn missed out on these programs.
Some very key insights there around the very different approaches to how we actually engage with men and boys. The review also showed that very few interventions considered indigeneity, culture, or gender or sexual diversity. What are the implications of those gaps?
This is such an important point, and it's one of a few that we highlight in our paper. And I'll focus kind of on this one, but we also had a couple of other points around cultural impact of diverse practice and the problems of piloting them. But I'll speak to this one that you've asked me about. So of our 42 interventions that were included in our review, only 2 directly addressed diverse backgrounds. So this lack of engagement really suggests a large gap in interventions that are failing to consider structural barriers like discrimination, lack of cultural safety, and inaccessible service delivery models. The colonial model of intervention, particularly in Australia, is concerning as research has repeatedly highlighted the lack of availability and evaluations of programs for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men, as well as men from migrant backgrounds. So we believe that this should be a call for more interventions to be directly addressing how programs can be safer, more accessible, and culturally appropriate to move away from this kind of one-size-fits-all approach.
Lovely. So you've started to speak to this question already with those recommendations there, but based on your findings, what do you see as the biggest implications for policy, practice, and future research?
Yeah, there's a lot of implications that we highlight in our review, but I'll just speak to a couple today. So in terms of policy, non-traditional responses and interventions need to be adequately supported beyond the pilot phase. And these types of interventions require long-term funding and commitment from governments and policymakers to have any measurable impact. In practice, practitioners in the sector should consider the accessibility of interventions for men in terms of culture, sexuality, and gender identity, and in the terms of physical space to effectively engage all men in interventions. And then for research, further research is needed to determine if a whole of community response could be effective in Australia and other countries where it's not traditionally been used to understand the impact that may have on engaging bystanders in interventions.
Thank you, Freya, and thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.
To help bring this research into practice, we're now going to hear from a practitioner working on the ground. Rimjim Jain is a gender equality and social inclusion specialist based in India. She leads strategy, program design and implementation at the Centre for Catalysing Change. Patrick and Freya spoke with Rimjim as part of this broader work across the Indo-Pacific. What follows is a fast-paced conversation about what this work looks like in real settings. Rimjim takes us on a quick tour of current initiatives in India. These range from frontline service delivery to community-based programs to work focused on changing attitudes, behaviours and systems. A strong theme throughout the conversation is context. Rimjim speaks about the role of community in responding to violence and the need to adapt approaches to local realities. She also makes a clear case for centering victim survivors. For Rimjim, success should be shaped by the people most affected, not imposed from the outside. Let's now turn to this pre-recorded conversation with Rimjim Jane, facilitated by Patrick and Freya.
Thanks very much for joining us, Rimjim, and for your time. And it was fantastic to have your participation in the roundtable back in August as we were reflecting, and your input, particularly around the complexities that occur across our region, but also particularly keeping the focus on victim survivors. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So maybe a place to begin is just for you to tell us a bit about the work you do and the context that you work in. And, I know that you've had an extensive history of working in this area, so I'm sure we'll learn a lot even from just you speaking about your work.
So thank you so much, Patrick and Freya, and greetings to you all from India, as well as to all the other presenters on this webinar, as well as to those who will be attending. And yes, it was great to attend the roundtable in Bangkok. And as a gender equality and social inclusion specialist who's based in New Delhi, and I've had an extensive body of practice on GBV prevention and response, and I've been leading GESI work in Indian and international NGOs, multilateral organizations and governments. So the work that I do is primarily carried out in low resource development settings. And currently I'm with the Center for Catalyzing Change, or C3 as it's called, where I lead strategy, program design and implementation. And C3 is a significant technical partner, I would say, to government departments in India, as well as to NGOs and multilateral agencies. We provide expertise, we provide hands-on support for gender integration in government schemes, in government programs and policies, helping to engender institutional spaces and to embed gender transformative approaches in large-scale social protection programs of the Government of India. And to give some context, these are development schemes and programs that reach literally millions of families. And our expertise is basically system strengthening from a gender lens. For instance, we are partnering with the country's flagship poverty alleviation program, the National Rural Livelihoods Mission, to integrate gender transformative approaches within it, with frameworks built on the recognition that women's economic empowerment cannot meaningfully occur, unless there is this framework or a foundation of enabling conditions, such as ending violence against them. So, because often what happens is that there is a lot of focus in such programs on things like thrift, credit, making financial instruments available to women, rural women, in low resource settings, as I mentioned. But unless the other social, economic context and situation around them is also dealt with, the progress is not necessarily regarding financial inclusion of women very meaningful. So, for instance, this livelihoods mission, the National Livelihoods Mission, it reaches about 100 million rural women who have been collectivized into 90 lakh self-help groups. And we've been partnering with this program in 4 states to institutionalize, for instance, gender resource centers at block levels close to where the community women live. And these are centers which provide integrated support to violence survivors. Why this is important? I can give some telling data that, for instance, in the state of Bihar, which is one of the 4 states which I mentioned we are working with earlier with the National Rural Livelihoods Mission, as many as 40% of all women have experienced domestic violence. This is the latest national level data which has come out. and only 3% survivors have sought help from formal services. So these gender resource centers under the Rural Livelihoods Mission is a unique model in which the SHG women themselves are capacitated to manage these centers. They are run in close proximity to the community, and these centers converge key first responder services like police, medical, legal aid, counseling, all of that, which is something what the one-stop centers also are mandated to do. But the one-stop centers are further away at the district level. And these gender resource centers, which are run by the SHG women themselves, they are very close to their homes, exactly where the villages and communities are. And then they help them to link to, as I mentioned, services and survivors. So that is part of the gender integration work that we do. Another very major work that we have, there was this path-breaking constitutional amendment which mandated reservations for women at the level of grassroots local government in India and the country, and which resulted in nearly 1.5 million elected women representatives coming into public and political life at the level of the local self-government systems. Yet there is still this culture of proxy leadership. The elected women are still known, for instance, as someone's wife or somebody's daughter-in-law. And there's even this very informally well-accepted title for their husbands called Sarpanch Pati, which means like husband of the local leader, the local female leader. So, the elected women representatives are facing extreme patriarchal backlash, social isolation, non-cooperation from their male peers. So where C3 comes in is helping them develop their own professional identity, which is a key milestone for them. For instance, even things like coming out of their house without covering their head and leading meetings, those are enormous achievements. And Center for Catalyzing Change is a significant technical partner to the government in building these elected women's capacities so that they can move away from the proxy leadership syndrome. And over the past few years, this work has evolved into a model of engendering governance and supporting thousands of these elected rural women to decide on things like budgets, make annual village plans, work towards development of their local constituencies from a gender and social inclusion lens.
Thank you so much, Rimjim. The work you're doing is so important, and particularly addressing the kind of systemic level for women, I think is so vital in this space, and really speaks to the kind of levels that violence and control and kind of disempowerment is happening at all these different levels. And it's so important. We're not just looking at the individual, but kind of at the system and how that's supporting or not supporting women. And the statistics you've got there are just so kind of alarming and heartbreaking, and just kind of really prove and show the value and the importance and the kind of urgency of the work you're doing. So it's so fantastic to hear. The kind of broad sense of your work is really focusing on women and girls, which is so valuable and vital. It'd be really interesting to kind of hear your experience of the roundtable and what you've taken away, or what you've kind of reflected on in terms of engaging men and boys in this space, particularly in addressing gender-based violence.
I would say while my current practice focuses on working with women and girls, I have worked very extensively on pioneering male engagement approaches in India and in South Asia. And I've coordinated networks of practitioners and civil society organizations working with men and boys on gender, both at the grassroots and globally, and engaged in knowledge building on the issue, on writing, sharing learnings and practices around it. And in fact, a lot of the work that I have done earlier on advancing women and girls' rights has been carried out through the pathways of engaging with men and boys, building their accountability on issues of violence prevention and response, on issues of family planning, maternal and sexual and reproductive health, father care, child rights, changing norms on early marriage of girls. The girls drop out from education, women's financial inclusion, their double burden on care and domestic work. So a lot of what the work that I've done in the past has been, outcomes related to all these issues, primarily by developing methodologies and ways of engaging with men to also work on them. And why this is important, as well as, based on the discussion that we had at the roundtable, and based on, I would say, all of these learnings, as well as what I'm doing currently, I would say a major understanding or a major learning which one needs to maybe develop further going ahead in some collaborative way, is the premise that women's empowerment efforts will automatically result in gender equality and prevention of gender-based violence. That does not always hold true, as we know. And the shift to change entrenched patriarchal norms, it can be very difficult. As we found that in our work in C3 also, that women's political and community leadership in what can be very highly male-dominated societies, it's shaped by social and institutional structures which have been traditionally mediated by men. So it's when we come in with programs that focus on working with women and girls, while of course that's extremely necessary, these are not necessarily sufficient in themselves without complementary efforts to shift the deep-seated mindsets among men often, that they are not becoming disempowered by sharing those same opportunities, authority, and rights with females. At one level, I think parallel tracks of involving men in communities and institutions through some specifically developed gender transformative methodologies can help to accelerate, it can help to strengthen and change the gender norms around gender-based violence in particular, which we find that those are the sort of core norms which are among the last to change. There could be other more visible sometimes, maybe more surface level norms which change, but regarding issues of violence, regarding issues of the change in gender balance in doing domestic and care work, those are the things which are more difficult to actually alter. And so to understand what would be the implications of this for designing, for scaling up, and for the durability of grassroots women's group-based leadership programs that, for instance, we engage with in India in C3, we feel more evidence building is needed. And, which also brings me to the discussion that we had at the roundtable, when some of the insights which stand out is the fact that while the individual work with men and boys is extremely important, it has to be at the same time rooted in structural change. And I think a lot of the participants also made the same point that at its core, what this means is that the work cannot stop at changing personal attitudes and behaviors of men and boys, but we need to institutionalize such approaches, and it's critical to do that to have a sustainable and long-term impact. And so when you're talking about policies and programming, they must have this dual approach of integrating individual community level engagement of men with more systemic level reforms also. So what that means is sort of repositioning the work with men and boys within maybe national policy frameworks on gender equality and violence against men. And I feel we need to develop some key entry points for doing this work, which could mean reviewing existing policies to see how to formally integrate male engagement, having dedicated planning, budgeting in social sector programs for male involvement, which in the case of India and a lot of the countries of South Asia, there are no such structured spaces and institutions for engaging men.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's got me thinking about a whole lot of things and the complexities and, some of the differences, some of the commonalities about sort of some of these drivers of gender-based violence that are sort of stubborn to shift often. For example, you mentioned about, the division of labour and domestic labour and things like that. And that sort of cuts a theme in terms of how we address some of these broader gender issues and some of the drivers. At the round table, we talked about some key themes around engagement, but also really how we do that in an accountable way to women and girls, people who have experienced violence. Not to do any harm, but to centre people's experience. So I'm really interested in your sort of views about this and the importance of this and how we can bring this to the work with men and boys. And you were beginning to sort of talk a little bit about some of those initiatives. So I'm really interested you say a bit more about your thinking and some of the innovations you're working with at the moment.
I think we had a lot of nuanced discussions at the roundtable around what accountability means, particularly accountability which is rooted in a local context, which is not necessarily a Eurocentric kind of a vision of accountability. And something that also I remember which came up was something that centers the needs and the empowerment of the women survivors themselves, which includes this whole do no harm principles to them. And there was this very interesting discussion that what does it really mean, accountability and do no harm in operationalization? And the fact is that it shifts depending on what are the cultural and social contexts. So it's not like accountability is necessarily a fixed outcome. In some societies, it might mean when you're talking about accountability of the perpetrator, and the perpetrator is not the only form of accountability. We can also look at accountability related to bystanders and institutions and all of that. But in the case of perpetrators, for instance, it could mean in some societies arresting the perpetrator, legal action and prosecution and all of that. But this must be a process that makes sense to survivors within their own world. And for a lot of women in community-based societies, the fact of, maybe their husband, if it is the case of intimate partner violence. And as we know, IPV is one of the highest forms of violence against women. So the husband being, for instance, legally convicted, charged, punished, and all of that, it may in fact result in a backlash on the woman and on her family itself and lead to greater stigma. So, whereas we as programmers and policymakers may feel that, that is the correct thing to do. And this is what will lead to probably long-term change. But from the point of view of the survivor, if it is not a solution which is improving her safety, her dignity, or her agency, So then it's not really accountability from her perspective, even if we feel that it, ticks our boxes of program frameworks. And similarly for men too, depending on the context of where they live, maybe it could responsibility may mean not just formal justice systems, but community-based accountability structures. To give an example of the work that we do, what we are trying to do is that there should be greater panchayat, which is these local self-government bodies in villages, panchayat level adjudicated processes for violence. For cases of violence against women. So we want that, it is the local systems themselves that should handle such cases. So the context-sensitive accountability approach would redefine maybe what it means for a man to take responsibility. I would say we need to define it collaboratively, not necessarily redefine, maybe redefine from the traditional Western constructs, but what really we mean by being gender supportive, what do we mean by restorative processes. It could mean public acknowledgement, which happens in public community acknowledgement of the violence, a sort of ongoing behavior change which is monitored by trusted community leaders, even religious figures, which has happened in some of the programs that I have worked in. So it means in practice that it has to be a survivor-defined metrics of accountability and success, asking women in their specific community what they would, how they would like to move forward, rather than maybe importing external indicators, having culturally resonant entry points for men. Using relationships, maybe using moral frameworks that they are more familiar and they're more comfortable with. So, and maybe it should be a combination of legal processes also, but also these sort of community and relational processes, and not just a single system.
Thanks so much, Rimjim. I think you raised such an important point around the context and really listening to victim survivors, not just kind of thinking about at a more broad policy practice level, but what is actually going to benefit the person that you are working with, because that's going to vary based on the community and the culture and the country, and every situation it's going to be different. So I really appreciate that point, and I think that's such an important thing to take away from this discussion is the context really matters. And I think that kind of leads into the next question around the role that community has in shaping how we respond to violence, and that kind of intersectional approach, which I know you've kind of spoken about a little bit already. But I guess I would love to know, are there kind of challenges in bringing that into practice, like realistically in your practices? Are there barriers to really adapting to that context and taking that approach?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really rich question, Freya. And, one needs to do honest examination, frankly, about why intersectionality matters in male engagement work, particularly in GBV work. How does it add to the work? And how intersectionality can or is an organizing principle in our work. So, at one level, being intersectional in our response to violence while doing male engagement work, it means recognizing that not all survivors experience violence in the same way. So in the Indian context, it would mean a Dalit woman, which is a so-called lower caste, backward caste woman, having experiencing certain forms of violence which come because of her the marginalizations which she experiences and how society sees her, and a woman with disability, trans women. So the fact that understanding that they all have compounding vulnerabilities, and that a gender-only lens, if we take in our implementing our programs or evaluations, that would then miss all these other, how these identities also affect their experiences. Also, men's relationship to violence also differs. That is also something that I have found in my practice, that it's the men have different they have differential powers, related to their caste, related to their class, to their sexuality, and all of that. So it means that the program should account for what type of men, which men one is engaging with, which survivors are being centered, and which structural forces are being addressed. So, like in the state of Bihar, where we are working, some of the areas have, there are these areas where extremely backward tribal communities, where delivery of services is very, I would say, it really needs to be speeded up, or there's not enough delivery of services. They're primarily agricultural communities. So the kind of almost structural violence which the men also face in such communities, and then how that is transmitted to the women in their communities, would be different from working in districts where there are more upper caste communities, where there would be a certain class difference, where maybe things like property and all of that is not being transmitted to, is not being transferred to women. Women don't have those rights, because traditionally these are families with lineage, and they want these assets to be passed down to male heirs. And then how that then disempowers women who may be upper class women, but there is a different form of violence. And then you have to deal with the men in those communities, those classes, castes, in a totally different way. So I think that really means, differing as per one's, that's how the intersectional response should differ. And our roundtable did flag these issues. For instance, we said that there were these, voices which are consistently being left out. We talked about, I think, LGBT individuals, indigenous people, those with disabilities. But really, it depends on the context in which we work, and how much we are able to nuance our work also. Like I find, for instance, that we often find it very difficult to speak about issues of sexualities, gender diversity, all of that. So, those are segments of people who totally get left out. We often leave out single women, women with disabilities, widows, all of that. So there's a lot more that we can do in centering intersectionality in practice. What is very important, one of the solutions is to have data systems that should capture intersectional experiences adequately and in a deep enough way. But what happens is that M&E frameworks, monitoring and evaluation frameworks, they typically capture data which is disaggregated by gender, maybe age, but they don't necessarily collect all the other forms of data. And so then unless something is visible, you don't see it, how do you even deal with it? And the other challenges, I would say, in intersectional programming is that it is truly complex to do it. There are no immediate simple answers. It needs sustained long-term funding. It's resource intensive. to design. Like you have to really go for, like, as I said, there are so many of these, pockets of, I would say, marginalizations that we don't necessarily deal with because, it's like we have something else in mind and it will be very resource intensive to then start designing for a different set of people. And it's also difficult to build replicable models if you are considering so many different forms and persons and contexts, because at one level we are all trying to build scalable models which can be applied across geographies, contexts, and all of that. But then it ends up disrupting all of those so-called the goals that we have. So I would say those are the challenges that we face.
Such a critical issue when we think about across our region, the Indo-Pacific, about the diversity and the challenges of scale and intersectional issues. And I think you've highlighted, even in one context, there's many intersectional issues that require consideration of implementation, even across different locations. One of the things that also that's had me thinking about what you've had to say is how you really highlight that, what might be seemingly correct or intuitive in terms of intervention. We really have to center back to survivors' experience of that. Our good intentions may not actually result in good outcomes. Across your working experience and working both with men and boys, but now more of a sole focus on women and girls. If we're to work with men and boys in this context, I'm really interested in, what guidance, that high level, what that's really shaped your work in working across those two different fields.
My key learning, or the key thing that I would like to share, is that there is a very clear need to expand and strengthen the work with women and girls through gender transformative approaches that engage with men and boys. And work towards transforming masculinities. We say that we are, working through gender transformative approaches, but in programs where we end up maybe viewing outcomes as solely related to women and girls, and one doesn't realize that it's extremely critical to develop that conceptual clarity around the rationale and the objective of engaging men and boys. So I think it is up to us practitioners to make that link and bring out that more clearly. And for instance, in the sectors that I'm currently working in and the large-scale public schemes and programs which are primarily so-called targeted at women and girls, these have largely remained outside the purview of male engagement on gender work. There's been, including in India and South Asia, I think some of the sectors where male engagement on gender has happened is in the context of health, a little more than others, maybe because of the entire HIV work. And also to some extent now in schools and in education programs in India, where otherwise, as I mentioned, there are no structured spaces for peer groups of men and boys in India and in South Asia, unlike women who have been collectivized in multiple programs. So it's easier to work with them in those sort of more systemic ways. So education and health are the two sectors where there has been work with men to some extent, but in most other sectors, this hasn't really happened. It requires an additional, a concerted effort to understand and to respond to the fact that men and masculinities have a very important role. They have to be addressed if we want to shape GESI-related outcomes and processes. Working with women and girls is not adequate. It's not enough. We need to identify those critical entry points within programs to integrate within them this approach of masculinities. There have to be a sort of, a series of critical first steps which have to be taken to develop strategies and interventions to have a stronger and deeper focus on male engagement and gender transformative approaches. And that also means engaging more closely with policymakers through data, through, evaluative evidence that the agenda of, working with men and boys on gender equality is equally the agenda of working with women and girls. And it has to be integrated into state-led programs, maybe the kind of large-scale programs that we are working on. And it can only lead to large-scale gender transformation. I think also sometimes what happens is that there is a fear of gender backlash, where we feel that working with men has to be, very well conceptualized. There has to be an entire ecosystem approach. Otherwise, it could lead to greater backlash. And it has happened in certain cases. So it has to be very well planned. There are no simplistic solutions. But also one of the additional things is that there is this great rise of the manosphere in India also, which does require systemic change. We cannot think that it will go away on its own. In India, we are as much influenced because of the internet and global linkages as with anything else. The men's rights activists in India, they've become very powerful. They've managed to influence institutional structures, legal spaces, and they've managed to contend that women are abusing legal remedies, and that, the protections and reforms, which have been very hard fought protections and reforms from the point of the feminist movement for women and girls, that they are being misused to harass men and their families. And so like domestic abuse, dowry harassment, sexual violence, all of that. And that does find a reflection in the way that courts respond, in the way societies respond. There is a slight wariness then of touching men on these topics or engaging with men on these topics. So, I mean, they're thorny, difficult topics, but I feel we cannot ignore them any further. And we need to develop collaborative strategies so that our discourse and our narratives and our methodologies can become equally a force to counter gendered disinformation, which is coming up from the manosphere all across the globe.
It really makes me think about, how we also, not only counter this, but how do we engage people who are in the manosphere and men who are, promoting these myths and misinformation about gender. It's a challenge that we're still very much struggling with, I think, in how best to engage.
I think one of the solutions which I know that you all are working on some sort of a digital platform, right? Which sounds very appropriate because a lot of the misinformation is emerging from the digital sphere and the digital spaces, which kind of then, there is this process of constantly, replicating it one after the other, opinions and all of that. So I think a digital solution is very much the need of the hour to counter what is digital misinformation.
I think one of the things that, in that Freya and I talk about in moving forward and in CEVAW to focus on men and boys is the question about, that's a complex question, but a simple question in one way is, what should we measure as sort of success and impact? What things would tell us we're making a genuine, sustainable difference? I'm just wondering about your thoughts about that.
No, that's extremely difficult because this is not quantitative data only. It has to be obviously a mix of qualitative and evaluations which measure change in men's attitudes and beliefs have to also then sort of link it to changes in their actual actions and behaviors. So what we have found in our work is that after some amount of engagement with them, men start speaking very quickly a language which may be correct, politically correct from the point of view of looking at gender equity. But how do you measure whether that is getting translated into changes institutionally within their homes, families, communities, and workplaces and all of that? So it's very difficult. And in fact, just to give an example, there was this study that C3 had carried out during the time of COVID to see whether the elected women representatives whom we are working with, because there was this greater burden of domestic labor on all women during that time, including on these women who were in political power. And we tried to evaluate whether, those who had supportive husbands who may have contributed to their domestic labor responsibilities, was that resulting in the women being able to carry out their professional responsibilities and all of that. And there was some findings, but it was very difficult. So the intent and practice to capture that in evaluation is all that I will say is extremely difficult.
What we heard from Rim Jim reinforces a key point. Change doesn't happen by treating men and boys as a problem to be fixed. It happens when we pay attention to context, when we work with community, and when we centre lived experience. These ideas lead directly into the final conversation we're sharing with you today. In this next pre-recorded interview, Patrick and Freya speak with Michelle from UNICEF and Jennifer from It's Evident about Seek the Ways, a digital platform co-created with Pacific Island boys and young men. Seek the Ways was developed in response to something many of us recognise. Young men are already going online to look for information about relationships, identity and masculinity, especially around topics that feel sensitive or hard to talk about elsewhere. This work meets that reality head on. It meets young men where they already are. What makes Seek the Ways different is how deeply it was co-created. In this conversation, you'll hear directly about what co-creation looked like in practice. Michelle and Jennifer also speak openly about what they learned along the way, about feeling uncertain at times, about sitting with discomfort, and about how much their own assumptions were challenged. They talk about the importance of not taking a deficit approach, of seeing boys and adolescents as experts in their own lives, and of grounding this work in Pacific cultures and value systems. This conversation offers a clear and practical example of how the principles we've been discussing today, culture, co-creation, accountability and care, can come together in practice. Let's now turn to the conversation with Michelle and Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I was wondering if you can speak about your role in working with boys and conceptualizing that need for engaging boys in addressing gender-based violence. How did you come into that space to work in that need?
Yeah, it's a good question and something we need to be really mindful of how we answer, because this topic can be sensitive within the space that right now we we all know, those working in the space and even outside that, we're currently finding ourselves in a sort of globally and locally space where there's gender equality backlash and there's pretty strategic anti-rights, movements. And we're seeing that, that sort of movement is undermining a lot of the groundwork that's been done to achieve how we eliminate gender-based violence. And we're seeing that in the Pacific as well. And so within the context of that, for UNICEF, we're trying to recognise how we can be responding to that issue as well, because we don't see that issue as going away. In fact, it is getting worse. And, there's been numerous publications and announcements on that globally and locally. So from the UNICEF perspective, I would say, when we think about engaging boys, it's being proposed as something that's, I would say, a necessary strategy to actually strengthen and accelerate the investment we're already doing in girls and not actually replace it. So that means we're kind of recognizing that a lot of the burden that we've actually, the burden of social change and ending violence is actually being placed on girls and women, when actually violence is a men's problem. And this is how we frame it, and most, feminist and women's movement frame it too. And we agree with that. And so I think within, the gender-based violence space, it's been widely recognised that we need to be, moving from this way of telling girls to be safe to teaching boys not to harm. So how do we do that? And then what is our role within that from UNICEF? Like I said, before, there's quite a lot of evidence-based showing that engaging boys can actually be like a protective or enabling strategy for girls' rights. And it can sometimes, be seen as a competing priority, which is why, I said it's really important how we frame this, what's our positionality in it. I think for us, our value add looking at this into space in the context of the Pacific, where there's a lot of programming investment looking at how we end violence and how we support girls and women to progressing gender equality. Our value add is very much around the kind of transforming harmful norms work and how we work with boys so that we can kind of bring them into the conversation and be a part of the solution. I think part of that process for us is recognizing that if we don't do this, we run the risk that those boys become the gatekeepers to girls' empowerment, to their safety, to their access to services. So given that, like, the approach for us would very much be around what we call ally work, or some may call allyship. And that approach is very much about boys coming alongside girls as allies and supporting them and recognizing that they can be a part, of the solution. They can be a part of actually preventing violence, calling out their mates online, offline, when it's safe to do, use bystander intervention techniques, or also just question harmful norms, like, harmful stereotypes around what it means to be a man, things like that.
Thanks, Michelle. That's really, that really captures the importance and potential of mobilising and how you begin those conceptualising about who to focus on, but how to balance the existing structural inequalities, as well as it really is a really nice segue into a question we've got about, your work with young Pacific wayfinders and really putting that in a cultural context in the Pacific, and how you've done that in a way that has enabled this to inform practice in this space in both culture, location, and then moving that to boys. What's some of your key learnings or key points from this work?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many, and I probably highlight like 5 or 6 which are just absolute necessary key things to consider for anyone that would be thinking about that they are working in this sector, that they want to look at engaging boys or young men in the violence prevention space or in primary prevention. I think there are really, really important things to remember about this. And Firstly, the number one for me would be that working with boys should never come from a sort of deficit approach, which sees, boys as some kind of problem that needs to be fixed. From my experience and many of those working in this field, this sort of approach, it never seems to work. And, very much from those who are social work perspective would be that it's using a strengths-based approach. So we're seeing children and adolescents as experts in their own lives so that they get to be a part of building those solutions. And then, in terms of thinking about it from being culturally grounded and resonant in this practice, I mean, here in the Pacific, where I'm really honoured and very grateful to be working alongside boys, men, and women and girls in this space. One thing that is particularly really important for us is that when we ground these programs in the cultural and Indigenous value systems, it means that they are actually sort of reshaping masculinity that aligns with Pacific cultural values. And there are, those are things that, for example, they center family, they center collective responsibility, respect, mutual reciprocity. There's a lot of values that are, can be harnessed in this work and they should be grounded in that. For the Young Pacifica Wayfinders, which is the boys advisory group, part of their mission statement is they have a part in the statement that says we want to redefine masculinity for an equitable moana. So they're sort of, thinking about, okay, how can we do this? We're not trying to change who we are or import a Western model, but we're trying to work within our own value systems and our own culture as well. A few other key pieces that I think are important, to note on this is having like a sense check on how you're working with engaging boys, also with girls and women. Any kind of intervention we design or any program we want to create with boys around GBV prevention, whether it's an activity, it's awareness raising, it's a group like Young Pacifica Wayfinders, we have to ensure that process is consulted with women's organisation during the design phase. So bringing them in to give feedback, being a part of that process. It's really easy, I think, to fall into the trap of creating boys programs that only listen to boys or only listen to men, but really important for them to actually be exposed to girls and women as mentors too, and be really clear to them that is a core part of programming intervention as well. And we do that with the Young Pacifica Wayfinders in that while they are a boys group, they are also very much working with in collaboration with girls reference groups here in the Pacific and feminist organisations. And that's a key part of it. And it's a non-negotiable for them. And they understand that from the very start. And then I think maybe a few others that are useful to note would be around co-creation. So I mentioned that before, the approach we take with the Young Pacifica Wayfinders is we recognise, they're agents of change. They're not problems to be fixed. So if we're going to do co-creation, it means whatever program or idea or activity we have in mind, it needs to be adolescent-led. When we do that, it maintains its relevance, its credibility, and its sustainability. But when I say co-creation, that doesn't mean, for example, you do 1 2-hour consultation with a group of boys and then you go away and design your program. For us, this means actually every step of the way, ideas are, created with and alongside boys. The ideas are their own. They feel that they own them. They feel that they're theirs. They're contributing to them. And transforming with them. And that's sort of what the Wayfinders group is. They are adolescent advisors for UNICEF. So they get to be a part of the planning and of the program much more beyond consultation. And you'll see that, for example, all of the design work around that group, whether it's their logo, their mission statement, their motto, everything is their own. It was designed by them. Their code of conduct was written by the boys. And that means that there's ownership in it, there's responsibility, there's accountability, and there's buy-in, and it's credible, all right? And then I think, I mentioned the engagement with girls and the importance of using the Indigenous and cultural value systems, but also those approaches, some of the methodologies that the boys use around how they learn. For example, in Talanoa approach here, it means that we're less likely to get into a format or a structure where we're teaching. The methodology we use is not actually teaching or training boys at all. We're not trying to teach them how to be men. We're not trying to control what masculinity looks like to them. We're actually just creating safe spaces for them to talk about these issues, to start to unpack what, masculinity could look like, and maybe some of the expectations about manhood or some of the gender stereotypes that they grow up with and that they see online and offline. And they themselves, in those spaces, they get to decide what is harmful and what is helpful, and understanding we're not trying to kind of prescribe that masculinity is bad or being a man is bad or you're inherently a perpetrator just because you are a boy. So, I think ultimately those approaches mean that we are kind of presenting them with a really diverse range of options of what masculinity can look like.
Yeah, absolutely. That's it really stands out to me about how much work you go to set the scene, to be, as you put the word, co-creators, and so often young people in general often get spoken at rather than engaged in a conversation of where they're at and that journey. Just sounds, I'm really curious about all the work that you need to do to set those sorts of conversations up, not to repeat sort of the dominant sort of way often young people are sort of engaged in this sort of work.
Absolutely. And I think it's so fantastic to hear about how these ideas around intersectionality are coming up naturally when we do genuinely collaborate and engage with young men and boys. We kind of make this assumption that might not be something that is valuable or important, but the fact that these are coming up naturally, I think we can learn a lot from how much trust and leadership we should be really listening to the young boys and men that are participating in these sorts of initiatives, and just the value we can get. And I think there's a lot we could learn from, even in the Australian context, how we really have that genuine collaboration, which I think is just so important. And kind of moving from that, Jen, obviously you're doing a lot of a similar work in that really genuine collaboration and consultation, kind of most recently on the Seek the Ways project, which is such a fantastic project that we would really love to kind of hear about how the project come about, your kind of experience as well, working with the boys in that kind of consultation and ongoing co-design that you've done, and how that's kind of informed the project.
Yeah, so Seek the Ways is an online website that you can find on www.seektheways.org. It's freely accessible to anyone, and we're collecting really as minimal data as possible on it. And it's really based on the work that the UNICEF Pacific team, and specifically Michelle, have been doing across the region, and trying to understand the needs of boys better as well. So she did large-scale consultations in, I believe, 2024, 2025, with 400 boys across the Pacific, where she saw that 73% of young men are going online to find information about those more sensitive topics that you don't really talk about. So things like puberty, sex, manhood, all of these sorts of things. And that's where the UNICEF team came up with this idea for a Seek the Ways platform, and we took on that project to create it for them. So it's really right from the start grounded in the voices of a lot of boys across the Pacific, and we wanted to make sure that we keep that motion going across the project as well. So in our very first consultation, we made sure that we talked to the boys, and we aligned it with the first consultation that Michelle did with the Young Pacific Wayfinders to, first of all, just get their inputs on what they think about a website like this, a little bit of a sense check on that, but then also for them to like start advising us as what they want out of this platform as well. That was a twofold approach in what they want it to be, but then also what they want it to look like. So in that very first consultation from the start, we just started to ask them a couple of questions around the design, familiar to them, what is it, what they like and dislike, as well as things like what do they need the website to be as a more concrete thing. Something that came out was that they needed it to be safe. They wanted it to answer questions that they had about growing up. And then design-wise, they wanted it to feel familiar to spaces that they're already engaging in. So like social media spaces like TikTok or gaming stuff. They were also really honest about how much it should look and feel like the Pacific. So I obviously come in as an outsider, and I understand that that is where I am. And so I'm very much learning from them. So they were very honest about what the characters should look like, what the environments should look like, what kind of stuff they're into. And we all took that into the creation of the end product that is online now. And we're going to continue that process over the next year as well, when we're updating the content and adding more content to and switching things up as well. The next step beyond the work that we do with the Young Pacific Wayfinders that is continuous was to make sure that the topics that are on the website actually reflect the lived realities of boys in the Pacific. So we did consultations with a total of 120 boys across 4 Pacific Island countries, where we had prior drafted the content that is now up on the website and let the boys review everything themselves. So we really wanted feedback from them on, does this reflect your lived reality? Do you understand it in general? But also, how do you say these things if you're communicating it with your friends? So it was a lot about the language and the way that boys are talking about these sorts of more sensitive topics. And again, I was surprised at how open and honest some of these conversations were, because the topics that are on the website are often more sensitive and things that you are not as commonly spoken about within communities and families in the Pacific just yet. So there's things around changing bodies and puberty and stuff like that that boys had not prior discussed with potentially, and some of the boys had not prior discussed with anyone except for in like sex ed in school if they had received it before. So we were nervous about that when we walked in, but we were also honest about it, that we're here to learn from you guys, and we're also here to answer questions that you may have. This is a safe space that you can talk to us about it. Nothing that we discuss in this room will ever trickle out to anybody within your communities. And then really once that that first hurdle was overcome and they started to trust us, it was really fun conversations about some of these topics as well. As an icebreaker to break the ice about some of them, we actually asked the boys to tell us a bunch of their local swear words for these more sensitive things. So there's a topic on penises on the website. So the boys were like yelling out the local words for this that they're usually not allowed to say to adults. And once that ice was broken, it was pretty much a fun and honest conversation about everything that we have created throughout that process. We did that in 2 rounds. So we went to 2 countries first, incorporated the feedback from the boys into the content that we had, and then we went back to 2 more countries with the already incorporated feedback to make sure that it just aligns and reflects what the boys in the other countries are seeing as well. Which then led us to what is now on the website.
Thank you so much, Jen. It's really interesting because I was thinking as you were talking about, a lot of these questions, there isn't a forum or a place for the boys to feel safe asking these sorts of questions, and they're really important life questions in many ways about that are really legitimate. And part of that is their own relationships to women and girls. And I was just thinking about how did you engage with that, not only that curiosity around sex and sexuality, but their curiosity about relationships to with women and girls.
So we had a list of all of the 47 topics that we have on the website, and the boys were able to choose the types of topics that they were most interested in and to work on those bits. And actually the ones surrounding sex and body changes were the ones that went first, and those who were curious about girls or relationships in general started to take those content pieces. And once they had like a piece of information in front of them, and they realized that through the work that we're doing with UNICEF and the research that we've been putting in, this is like safe, neutral information that they have, they also started talking to us about how this affects their own lives and what they find is reasonable and not. In general, just like to talk about their own experiences and how what they see in their families or in their own lives. And we respect that. And we also always make sure that we try and reflect that in what they're seeing in the content as well. So even if they're telling us more some of these dominant masculinity norms that are happening within their communities or within their families, we try and see how we can incorporate that into the website and give them a positive alternative to that. So they see themselves and their lived realities reflected in it, but at the same time, we're also offering a positive alternative that they could just consider and think about. So something that we're really trying to do is just give as much positive information as a boy can receive. And the decision that they make for this is in the end always still their own. Because like Michelle said in the beginning, we really believe that the basis of everything is that boys want to grow up to be the best version of themselves and the best men that they can be. It's just really confusing at times to make the right decisions, and you're influenced by so many things. So the more information and the more positive information that we can give them, the more likely they are to make their own decisions about who they want to be.
That's such an important point, having that sense of trust and faith that the boys want to be the best version. How do you think they felt in their overall sort of position to actually have that trust and safety? Did you feel that was something new for them, or was that something already something culturally important, or something that they wanted to develop more of?
I think in general that the boys all were struggling with this question of what is a real man, and who do I want to be as a man. It wasn't that they were asking that question in that way, and we don't have a definitive answer of what that is, right? They just draw the information from all these different resources. So it's like what they see in their community, what they're seeing online by the manosphere influencers, but also maybe more positive influencers that they're seeing online, what they're hearing from their peers, and so on and so forth. So I think that they were struggling with it, and they were still like building their own opinion about it, but they didn't come to a conclusion of what it is yet, and we're not giving that to them. They have to come to that conclusion themselves. So it's really about us being neutral, and I'm not trying to push a Western agenda within the Pacific. I'm just trying to give information, and that's something that I always clarify when I'm talking to them. I'm really not trying to impose anything onto them.
And that sounds like the whole resource too is very much geared in that way. Like you were saying, in the next version you're updating it, so it's not it's not, ever a final piece. It's an ongoing development with their journey.
Yeah, totally. And I think that also reflects what Michelle was saying in the beginning, right? That we're really trying to center the young person in this, and that comes with changing ideas and changing how you think about things, also through the different life cycles you go through. You also learn over the course of this process, but also just over the course of your life as well.
To wrap up this conversation, I just wanted to kind of open the floor to both of you. If there's any kind of key takeaways you'd like to offer practitioners working in this space, or anything that you just kind of like to end on.
Yeah, I think it's that continuous stepping back, checking in with women and girls around design, continuously through the program cycle, continues through consultation, bringing them in, and also having boys and men exposed to that process, because that's a reality of life. And boys right now are growing up in a world that is changing. Their privileges are being questioned. They're no longer always going to be able to step into positions of being the leader of a company, a CEO, a politician. Things are changing, not as fast as we would like them to. We haven't reached gender equality, but they are. And unless that they are exposed to the spaces where they are being questioned safely and they understand that, they can be in conversation with women and girls, they can have those privileges rightly tested and feel challenged, feel really uncomfortable in them. We're not meant to protect them from that. That is what needs to happen. So I think that's the big piece for me. And I won't say that we're experts in this. I think we're very much right now in the process, and we're learning along the way.
Just to decentralize yourself in this, we're really trying to listen to the needs of the young person, and we're really trying to understand their perspective of what's happening in their lives as well. Things have drastically changed to when we have grown up, so we need to better understand these lived realities to be able to support young people better as well. So just really listening, and also sometimes sitting with the discomfort around the things that the boys are saying and the things that we do not know ourselves is something that we've been trying to do throughout this entire process, and is also a bit of a learning curve for myself. It's just every once in a while, when you're in a conversation with a young person, you just get so humbled about the assumptions that you had about the lived reality of somebody. And that's a good thing, because we're learning from it, and that's what we try to build the programming out of, and make sure that it's actually helping the people that we're trying to support.
Brilliant. Thank you both so much. I think I might end our conversation here, even though I would love to talk for hours with you both. Just thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your knowledge with us. It's just incredible work that you're both doing, and I'm so excited to hear where this all goes next.
We've come to the end of our session, and I'd like to thank our presenters for their generosity, insight and candour, and thank all of you for spending time with us. Across today's conversations, we've heard about the diversity of ways people are working with men and boys across the Indo-Pacific. From research that challenges dominant models to practice that is deeply grounded in culture, community and lived experience. We've been reminded that effective prevention is not about fixing men and boys, but about engaging them as partners in change, listening to them, trusting their insight, and creating spaces where they can explore who they want to be in ways that feel safe, relevant, and real. The example of Seek the Ways shows what becomes possible when this work is done with care and humility, when young people are centred not just as participants, but as co-creators. It offers a hopeful reminder that boys and young men want to grow into their best selves, and that our role is to walk alongside them as they do that. We'll be sharing a small selection of videos created as part of Seek the Ways at the end of this recording, so please stay with us for those. A recording of today's webinar will also be available on the WorkUP website shortly, and we encourage you to share it with colleagues and networks who may find it useful. I'm Teresa Kellett, and on behalf of WorkUP, thank you for joining us today, and goodbye.
You want to be a real man? Some people say being a real man means having muscles, making lots of money, solving problems on your own, or never showing weakness. Some of these ideas can be good, like being responsible or caring for others, but they can mess with you if you take them too far. You might end up in fights just to prove you're strong, or you find it difficult to ask for help when life gets tough. But here's something you might not hear enough. You decide the kind of man you want to be, not your friends, not influencers, not your feed. There's no single way to be a man. Being a man looks different across cultures, families, and people. Being a man doesn't mean being hard all the time. It means staying true to your values, admitting when you're wrong, working with others, not controlling everything, strong enough to care, brave enough to ask for help. That's a real man. Want to grow to be a real man? Start here. Think about what matters to you. Follow your true values, not what influencers or others say. Find role models who treat people with kindness and respect. Build friendships where you can talk real stuff, so you can support each other through the challenges. That's real strength. That's real manhood.
You might think you're a good boyfriend, checking her phone, telling her not to hang out with certain people, making all the decisions, making her feel bad when she says no. But let's be clear, that's not care, that's control. Controlling and manipulative behavior, sometimes called coercive control, is when one person tries to dominate the other. It's not always with physical violence. Sometimes it's with pressure, guilt, or fear. Technology can also make it easier to cross the line. If you're expecting her to reply instantly, tracking her location, checking her followers, that's control, not care. Even if you've never hit her, the emotional damage is real. She might stop seeing friends, lose confidence, or feel depressed. You might tell yourself, I'm just protecting her. But if she feels scared to speak up, that's not protection. That's control. Jealousy and control aren't signs of love. Respect and trust are. You might think, she hasn't broken up with me, even with how I act, so it's fine. But breaking up isn't easy. She might be scared, unsure, or afraid of your reaction. You might think, I love her, so I should know everything. But love is about trust. Just like you want your own space and privacy, so does she. Want to build real love? Do this. 1. Check yourself. Are you being respectful or controlling? 2. Support her independence. Her friends' passions and plans still matter even when you're not involved. 3. Practice communicating. Say, would you be open to, and actually listen to her answer. 4. Ask for help if needed. Noticing toxic patterns in yourself? Owning up and getting support isn't weakness. It's courage and maturity. You don't need to control someone to feel strong. Real men don't control. They support. They trust. Rejection sucks. Breakups hurt. But it happens to literally everyone, and it doesn't mean you're not good enough. Even confident, successful guys get rejected. They just roll with it and go again. It's not about your looks, your money, or how alpha manly you are. Sometimes it's about timing. Sometimes it's just not the right fit. And that's okay. Everyone gets to decide who they like. You have that right. And so does she. Rejection doesn't define your worth. It just means this one wasn't the right one. You might be hurt, confused, or even angry. It feels painful now, but it doesn't define you. The real strength is how you respond to it. Here's how to deal like a real man. 1. Respect her choice. Don't pressure her to stay with you. If you want, you can ask for what you could have done better, but you must accept it with respect. 2. Let yourself feel it. You're allowed to be sad. That doesn't make you weak. 3. Talk to someone you trust. A fresh perspective can help. 4. Take a break from social media. Checking her profile won't help. That just makes it worse. 5. Refocus on yourself. Sleep well, move your body, eat good food, or hang out with friends. Whatever makes you feel good. Getting rejected doesn't make you less of a man. How you handle it shows what kind of man you are. You lost a relationship. You didn't lose your value. Keep moving on.